Tonight on Nation and Nation, COP26 recently ended with a climate deal signed, but climate activist Eriel Deranger says it still allows the oil and gas industry to thrive.
It's very small incremental change, and there are very few safeguards for Indigenous rights and for Indigenous peoples to be included in the processes moving forward.
And while Canada's Environment Minister supports the deal, Steven Guilbeault concedes it is watered down on Indigenous rights.
Some countries who have Indigenous populations aren't even willing to acknowledge that these population exists, let alone entrenching something that's legally binding in an international treaty.
Welcome to Nation to Nation. I'm Brett Forster. The International COP26 Climate Summit concluded in Scotland last week with a deal. Nearly 200 countries signed the Glasgow Climate Pact. They agreed to combat climate change, phase down coal power, and cut greenhouse gas emissions. The accord couldn't come at a more critical time, from the floods and landslides devastating British Columbia this week to record-breaking summer heat and wildfires that ripped across the country. The climate crisis has arrived, and Indigenous people are often on the front lines. To discuss all this is my first guest, Environment Minister Steven Guilbeault. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Brett.
So, Minister Guilbeault, why does Canada support this agreement?
Well, for many reasons. For one, climate change is a global crisis. It's a global problem. Therefore, it needs global solutions. No one country, no matter how big or powerful it might be, can go at it alone. Which is why this work at the international level, by the concert of nations, is so essential in the fight against climate change. And Canada has been, since 2015, an active player on the international scene by my predecessor, Minister McKenna, Minister Wilkinson, who co-chaired one of the working groups for the Glasgow conference on one of the key pillars of that conference. And I should say, co-chaired successfully that working group.
There is some language in the Pact about Indigenous rights and consulting with Indigenous groups. The preamble says the parties should consider the rights of Indigenous peoples, not must respect those rights. What would be your response to Indigenous groups saying it's weak in that regard?
Canada would agree with that analysis. I would too. We have been pushing for many years on strong language at the United Nations level, and certainly as part of the climate change negotiations on the rights of Indigenous peoples. Unfortunately, not all countries agree with us. In unfortunately too many cases, some countries who have Indigenous populations aren't even willing to acknowledge that these population exists, let alone entrenching something that's legally binding in an international treaty. That being said, we will continue to push for that. And actually, Canada is, if not the country the country that has the most Indigenous representative as part of its official delegation. We're certainly amongst the top countries in the world to make space on the delegation for Indigenous voices, Métis, First Nations, as well as Inuit, in a way really that I think no other country does.
Now, as the summit unfolded, your critics on the right accused you of being too radical, while your critics on the left were accusing you of being not radical enough. What should Indigenous groups expect as you take the reins on the climate file?
I don't see how talking about and putting in place measures to fight climate change would be radical. As you rightly pointed out in your introduction, we have entered a world where the climate is changing, and we are seeing manifestation almost daily, either here in Canada or around the world, when it comes to climate impact and extreme weather events. And as you also rightly pointed out at the beginning, Indigenous people are often at the forefront of those impacts, and Indigenous communities are in many cases severely affected by the impacts of climate change. We need to do more to fight climate change. We need to do more to adapt to climate change as well, because it's already upon us. So those who feel I'm a radical for wanting to do more when it comes to both adapting to climate change, but also reducing Canada's contribution to the problem, well, I'll certainly accept that epitaph.
Now, it may not be totally covered in the Pact, but Canada has a constitutional duty to consult with Indigenous groups on federally regulated projects. How will you ensure your department meets that obligation?
My previous portfolio was Heritage Minister, and one of my responsibility there was the co-implementation of the Indigenous Language Act, which was adopted in 2019, and which is the first time in Canada's history where a new piece of legislation wasn't done alone by the federal government, but it was actually co-constructed with Métis First Nation and Inuit people. Now, I'm not saying that exercise was perfect, but it was certainly a first attempt to try and change the way we do things in Canada. And I'm hoping to bring that experience with me at Environment Canada. And I think that the department cares deeply about its relationship with Indigenous people and ensuring that their voices are heard and that they're at the table when decisions are made when it comes to climate change.
The federal government is also now legally obligated to harmonize its laws with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. So will Indigenous sovereignty, free, prior, and informed consent be respected under your watch?
Well, one of the things we've started talking about is how exactly how does the application of UNDRIP and the fact that it's not a law in Canada applies to different ministries, and that's certainly true of Environment Canada and Environment and Climate Change Canada, that has a very specific role when it comes to engaging Indigenous people on a whole range of different issues. I was talking about climate change, the issue of climate change, but we could be talking about new proposal for conservation area, national parks, and frankly, I don't see how going forward these things could be done without without the implication and prior informed consent of Indigenous people, and we have in fact very encouraging examples of where we have started doing that in Canada, but we need to do better, and we need to do more of it.
COP26, the deal pledges to do a lot of things that we haven't quite touched on, among them stopping deforestation and ending inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. So how do you square those promises with Canada's economic reliance on these industries?
Well, certainly we've been very clear on fossil fuel subsidies during the last election campaign. There's a G20 commitment to phase out those fossil fuel subsidies by 2025. We've committed to do that 2 years earlier than our G20 partners, so Canada will do this by 2023. When it comes to stopping deforestation, it is going to be a lot of heavy lifting, and will require finding agreements with provinces and Indigenous people across the country. As you know, the extraction of natural resources is a provincial jurisdiction, but that doesn't mean that the federal government doesn't have a role to play, and we certainly want to play this role in collaboration with Indigenous peoples and provinces and territories.
Okay, just finally, I know you weren't in government at the time, but Ottawa did buy a bitumen pipeline. So what's your response to critics who say the deal is too weak to adequately address the urgency of the crisis?
I think if you were to look at one single element of any government's action, should it be us, the U.S., the European Union, Japan, even Norway, you could always find something to disagree with. I would argue that you should look at the global picture. And the global picture since 2015 is that we've already put in place a price on pollution that is one of the most ambitious in the world. We are investing record level in clean technologies, renewable energy, including helping Indigenous communities reduce their reliance on diesel, record level investment in public transit. In fact, our Green Recovery Plan is the number one recovery plan of all G7 countries, and it comes in second place for G20 countries. So I think we have started moving the dial in Canada, but I'll be the first one to recognize that so much more needs to be done.
Okay, Minister Guilbeault, I want to thank you for your time. Thanks for coming on Nation to Nation.
My pleasure, Brett. Thank you very much.
Coming up, the Executive Director of Indigenous Climate Action is still in Glasgow. Eriel Deranger joins me to offer a grassroots take on the deal. Welcome back. As we just discussed, COP26 wrapped up recently in Scotland with a deal to combat climate change and cut greenhouse gas emissions. Some are cautiously optimistic, but critics say it doesn't go far enough. China and India aren't making cuts quickly, and there are concerns about Indigenous rights. Eriel Deranger is the Executive Director of Indigenous Climate Action. She attended COP26 and is, in fact, still in Scotland. Deranger joins me now from Glasgow. Welcome to Nation to Nation.
Thank you for having me.
After the summit ended, you said in a statement that the final text of the agreement left you sad, angry, and scared. Why is that?
I think the reality is there's a couple of things to take into consideration here. The highest or the largest delegation that attended COP was oil and gas executives and lobbyists. And so a lot of the deals that happened at the COP were really to ensure that those industries continue to thrive as we slowly, very slowly make a transition away from heavy intensity fossil fuels. But the reality is it's very small incremental change, and there are very few safeguards for Indigenous rights and for Indigenous peoples to be included in the processes moving forward.
Now, there were several Indigenous-led groups and organizations at this year's conference, so do you feel as a collective that you achieved very little?
I think that there were definitely some really key and critical moments. You know, we have Indigenous rights language sort of in the preambular text of a thing called Article 6, and this is for creating a global carbon market mechanism. And while there is language that recognizes our rights, we're not included in the participation, design, and implementation of what those carbon markets would look like. And carbon markets are just essentially ways to commodify the land and the air and our traditional lands that are already at risk and being appropriated for oil and gas development.
So how do you think the deal fares when it comes to Indigenous rights then? Do you think that language is a bit watered down, a bit too weak?
Yes, I think that it's incredibly watered down. We didn't get what we wanted to. We have small angles to move forward, and I think that there's still room for us in future negotiations to advocate for more protections as we move forward. But the reality is a lot of what we aimed for just didn't happen, and I think that's largely because of the oil and gas lobbyists having a heavy hand in those negotiations. That said, I think we are worlds apart from where we were during the Paris Agreement or in Copenhagen in 2009, where Indigenous rights were heavily debated. And now we're seeing it to be something that's at least talked about, but we're still not at the point where we're in the driver's seat or making decisions.
So how would you rate Canada's performance at this year's conference overall?
That's a really good question. I think that, you know, when they looked at the profile index, they always release like where the countries stand. And Canada is the fourth from being the worst as far as emissions. And so we're seeing that Canada is like continuing to fail, reducing their actual emissions. And I think that carbon markets are one of the ways in which Canada is going to look to cook their books by looking for offset programs as opposed to actually reducing their emissions and making sure that they're meeting the demand and the goal of keeping temperatures 1.5 degrees, which is super critical with what we're seeing in BC with the massive flooding right now. We need to be doing more, and we need to be doing it quickly, and Canada is not doing enough.
So how optimistic are you, as you just mentioned, that this deal will actually meet the goal of keeping temperatures below 2 degrees and ideally 1.5 degrees?
So we still have a lot to be determined as far as what these global markets carbon markets are going to look like and how they're going to be utilized for setting standards in countries for reducing emissions. And I think we still have a lot of work to do. And so I think that if we continue to push harder and say certain things cannot be used as offsets, that we might be able to make those commitments. But the reality is we're just at the beginning of ensuring we have levers to hold governments accountable that they actually reduce emissions. Because if we're not actually reducing emissions, stopping and phasing out coal and oil and gas, we're in real danger of not meeting those goals.
Now, if you could have coffee with him, what would you tell Environment and Climate Change Minister Steven Guilbeault?
I think that I would say that we need to be driving for better inclusion of Indigenous peoples as decision makers in the design and implementation of climate policy, and that we also have to look at what it means to recognize and acknowledge sovereign and self-determined nations in this country, that we cannot simply be going through the Indigenous peoples organizations like AFN, ITK, and MNC. We need to be looking at all communities and how they see themselves as part of the equation to be putting forward these policies, and how our knowledge is just as important as Western science, and that we have so many solutions on the ground in our communities that are viable and that should be duplicated at a national level.
Do you think the catastrophic flooding, as you referenced earlier, that hit British Columbia recently be enough to change the way all levels of government approach climate change?
Well, I would hope so. I mean, one of the things that's really striking about the flooding is that some of the TMX pipeline, which has been a contentious issue for years, was actually washed out by this flooding. And this is a pipeline that will be carrying tar sands oil, one of the heaviest crude oils in the world, to the shores, to tankers, which put a lot of environmental and culturally sacred spaces at risk for communities. And so I would hope that this is a clear message that we have to be aggressive and progressive, and we have to be collaborative in our decision making and creating policies on climate, and that we simply cannot just be making incremental change any longer.
Okay, Ms. Deranger, that's all the time we have for this segment, so I would like to thank you for coming on Nation to Nation.
Thank you so much for having me.
After the break, we speak to the new Commissioner of Indigenous Languages, and what will Dr. Ron Ignace do to preserve it? Welcome back. Many Indigenous languages are on the brink of extinction. It's my next guest's job to change that. Dr. Ron Ignace was appointed as the country's first Commissioner of Indigenous Languages in June. His office was created in 2019 when the Indigenous Languages Act passed into law. He's mandated to, among other things, promote Indigenous languages, educate the public, and support efforts to revitalize and reclaim them. Ignace is a member of the Secwepemc Nation and former elected chief who joins me from Kamloops, British Columbia. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, and good morning to you.
So fill me in. What has the Commission been doing these last 5 months?
Well, I would like to first of all say greetings from Kamloops, which is the heartland of the Secwepemc Nation, and from inside the Kamloops Indian Residential School, where I thought it fitting to establish the first Indigenous Language Commissioner's office from a facility that I ran away from in 1962. And it's an honor to be back as the first Indigenous Language Commissioner of Canada in such a facility.
So the Act seems to give you wide latitude to pursue your mandate, which is also quite broad. How do you go about achieving it?
Well, I would like to, I've been schooled in our creation stories, and we have a creation story that has guided me in terms of working towards the co-development of the legislation. And the story is such that there was 4 men and a nephew that lived with their grandmother. And she said, I had the knowledge and the wherewithal to defeat the cannibals, and you have the wherewithal to carry it out. So he builds himself a mica shield and goes and transforms these cannibals and lays down the law of reciprocal accountability and quiet enjoyment of the land. To me, this Indigenous language legislation is like that shield. So no more will our children have to fear their mouths being washed with soap or being beaten for speaking their languages, or for parents or elders teaching their children their Indigenous languages. That's what that signifies to me.
So, as you mentioned earlier, the first thing residential schools targeted was language. So do you see language revitalization as a form of resistance?
I see it as a way of my view is that no language ought to be left behind, and nor should it stand in the shadow of others. So I see as revitalizing, reviving, and strengthening, maintaining our languages as a way of self-determination. And reaffirming our identity and our place within the Canadian society as such. So it's an important component of who we are as a people and our rights as nations across the country.
So what policy objectives does your office need to achieve in order to be considered a success?
Well, we are right now, we are building, we've taken, because of the complexity of our work and the immensity of our mandate, we are taking the time to, and there is no blueprint for the establishment of a commission. We're building it from the ground up. So we're taking the time to build a strong and enduring commission that will be able to assist in the revitalization of languages across the country and to create transformative change that will lead to the revitalization and the viability of all languages across the country.
And finally, does the Act ensure predictable long-term funding for your office? And if not, how much does that concern you?
Oh, that's part of our mandate. When the legislation was established, they stated that they're going to have predictable and sufficient and appropriate funding. And the reason that it was left vague is because no one knew what the cost of the language revitalization across the country would be. So we have, part of our mandate is to conduct a costing study that will determine what that is and to ensure that there's predictable, long-term, and appropriate and sufficient funding. So that right now it's more of like a lottery ticket where you put in a proposal and hope to get funded. You cannot predict from one year to the next. It's instability. So we need to create resourcing that people can begin planning long-term, 5, 10, and 15 years ahead, because of it takes a while. It takes 2,000 to 2,500 hours to create a viable speaker in the language. So that you have to, and then you have to plan for teachers and so on. That takes time. So we need the type of resourcing that people can begin planning ahead and be confident that they will be able to attain their goals and objectives.
Okay, Commissioner Ignace, I want to thank you for your time. Normally I would say goodbye here, but there are no goodbyes in Ojibwe. Since we are discussing language, I suppose I should say Bamapi gi gawabmin minawa, which means loosely, until we meet again.
Thank you for giving me this honor to speak to you and to the people across this country about an important work that is being conducted for once with our rights solidly recognized and enshrined in a constitution. Thank you.
Thank you. And when we meet again next week, the House of Commons will be back in full swing. Until then, remember to check out our podcast or watch past episodes online. Go to aptnnews.ca/nation to nation. I'm Brett Forster. Thanks for watching.